There's a certain kind of silence that only palaces know. Not the silence of empty rooms, but the silence of held breath. Millions of people all over the world, pausing whatever they're doing, staring at a phone screen or a television, waiting for news that nobody actually wants to hear, but everybody already suspects. That kind of silence fell over Britain and then over the world, twice within the space of 6 weeks in early 2024. First for a king, then for a princess. And in that silence, the most famous royal family on earth quietly began the hardest chapter of its modern history. People who had watched Catherine, Princess of Wales, walk through the doors of Westminster Abbey on her wedding day in 2011, poised, radiant, unhurried, as though she had been born knowing exactly how to carry the weight of a crown she wasn't even wearing yet, could not quite reconcile that image with the one forming in their minds in the weeks and months of early 2024. She had disappeared, not dramatically, not with a statement or a farewell. She had simply gone quiet, the way a candle goes out, there one moment, and then not. Kensington Palace had been careful about the language. Major abdominal surgery, non-cancerous condition, recovery at home. The words were meant to be reassuring, and for a while, they were. People wish her well, kept their distance, and waited. But then the week stretched. The public engagements did not return. The usual stream of photographs. Catherine crouching down to talk to a child at some school event. Catherine laughing in the wind at a sporting occasion. Catherine standing composed beside William at some formal ceremony. All of it went quiet. And when a woman that visible goes that quiet for that long, the world starts to fill in the blanks on its own. Speculation grew in the tabloids. Theories multiplied on social media, some of them absurd, some of them unkind, most of them simply the noise that pours into a vacuum when institutions say too little for too long. The palace stayed measured. The palace stayed controlled. And then, on a Friday in March 2024, Catherine herself stepped into that noise and silenced it in the most personal way imaginable. She sat in a garden. She spoke directly to the camera. She did not read from a prepared statement in the way that public figures do when they are managing a crisis. She spoke the way a person speaks when they have already cried everything out and have arrived on the other side of the crying, calm and clear and carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has rehearsed difficult words until they no longer feel dangerous to say. She told the world that after her surgery in January, tests had revealed the presence of cancer. She said it had come as a huge shock. She said she was in the early stages of treatment. She said she was focused on healing and that the most important thing she and William had spent the past weeks doing was finding the right way to explain all of it to their 3 children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, in a way that would not frighten them more than necessary. She said, "I'm going to be okay." The world exhaled. But exhaling is not the same as resting easy, and the weeks that followed Catherine's announcement were not simple for anyone connected to the British monarchy. Because 6 weeks before Catherine sat in that garden and looked into that camera, Buckingham Palace had issued a very different statement about a very different member of the family. King Charles III, the 75-year-old monarch who had ascended to the throne only in September 2022 after the death of his mother Queen Elizabeth II, had been diagnosed with cancer. This had been discovered during a procedure for an enlarged prostate. The prostate issue itself was not cancer, but the investigations had found something else. The palace did not specify what. They said he would begin treatment promptly and would step back from public-facing duties while he did so. For the British monarchy, this was territory with no map. There had never been a moment in living memory when both the king and the heir's wife, 2 of the most central figures in the public face of the institution, were simultaneously fighting serious illness and absent from view. The senior working royals who remained were doing what they could. William, who was watching his wife go through treatment while also watching his father do the same, had described the period simply and quietly as brutal. It was not a word a Prince of Wales was supposed to say in public. It was not a polished word, not a diplomatic word, not a word chosen from the approved register of royal communication. It was the word a son uses when he does not have a better one. And that small breach in the careful language of royal life said more than any official statement could. Charles had spent decades preparing for the crown. He had waited longer than any heir in British history. His mother had reigned for 70 years. When the moment finally came, it came with grief, because all coronations or funerals looked at from the other direction. And then, barely a year into his reign, the illness arrived. He had to step back from the ribbon cuttings and the state visits and the formal addresses, the endless machinery of a working monarchy that requires a visible figurehead to keep turning. He continued his paperwork. He continued the private work of the crown. But the public face, the face that the country needed to see, was largely absent. Catherine's absence ran parallel, and in some ways ran deeper in the public consciousness, because Catherine was not just a royal figure. She was something the monarchy had not always been able to claim. Genuinely, widely beloved. Not simply respected, not merely admired from a constitutional distance, but loved in the way that people love someone they feel they understand. She had arrived as a young woman from a regular middle-class family and spent years learning an entirely new language. The language of royal comportment, of duty, of never showing the seams, and she had learned it well enough that it no longer looked like learning. She had also, with William, brought something to the institution that the previous generation had struggled to consistently offer: the image of a genuinely warm family. 3 children who were photographed at public events not as props, but as real children, sometimes fidgeting, sometimes laughing at inappropriate moments, once memorably pulling faces during a military flyover. It was the realness of it that made people feel connected. And when that realness went behind closed doors for month after month, the absence was felt personally by millions of people who had never met her and never would. The children did not stop attending school during those months. Life inside Kensington Palace continued to move. There were meals and homework and bedtimes, all the ordinary anchors of family life that continued whether or not the cameras were watching. William managed the public schedule as best he could, showing up to engagements alone, keeping things moving, carrying whatever he needed to carry, and not discussing it publicly beyond that single word brutal, which had slipped out and landed like a stone in still water. Catherine's treatment was what doctors call adjuvant chemotherapy, preventative, administered after surgery that had removed the cancer itself, designed to reduce the chance of it coming back. It is a treatment that saves lives precisely because it attacks the possibility of recurrence, but it is not a gentle process. It works throughout the whole body. It is exhausting in ways that do not always translate into visible symptoms, exhausting in ways that make the ordinary texture of a day feel like a mountain. And she was doing it largely out of sight, in a way that she had been asked to do almost everything difficult in public life, quietly, steadily, without allowing the machinery of her own suffering to become a spectacle. Across town, at Buckingham Palace, Charles was also continuing his treatment. His team was more guarded about the specifics. He was seen occasionally, reading get-well cards outside the palace, meeting a small number of visitors, but the full program of royal duties remained suspended. The 2 of them, King and Princess, were moving through the same season of illness from their different households, connected by family and by something else, something that only a diagnosis gives you. The knowledge that the body is not a reliable instrument, that plans are provisional, that time is not guaranteed in the way that healthy people quietly assume it is. The country watched. The world watched. And underneath the watching, underneath the sympathy and the concern and the occasional intrusive speculation, there was something else that nobody said out loud, but everyone felt: a question about what came next. Whether they would come back. Whether the monarchy, already navigating the turbulence of a new reign and the complicated aftermath of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex's departure from royal life, could sustain this level of absence from its most visible and beloved members. Whether when Catherine and Charles did eventually return, it would be the same. Whether they would be the same. That question would take months to answer. And the answer, when it came, would not arrive all at once. It would come in stages, in glimpses, in a wave for a palace balcony on a summer afternoon. in a quiet visit to a cancer ward where a princess sat down beside a patient and said simply, "I know," in a king stepping back onto a stage he had feared he might not return to, and finding that the audience was still there, still watching, still willing to believe that the story was not finished. The silence of early 2024 was real, and it was heavy, and it lasted longer than anyone had expected. But silences, even the heaviest ones, eventually break. And the breaking of this one turned out to be one of the most watched, most felt, most quietly extraordinary chapters in the modern history of the British Crown. The first time Catherine appeared in public after her diagnosis, the world did not quite know how to react. It was June 2024, the annual Trooping the Colours ceremony in London, the parade that marks the official birthday of the monarch, and she arrived not on foot but in a carriage dressed in white, her 3 children beside her. George sat straight and serious, already practicing the gravity of a boy who knows what he will one day be asked to carry. Charlotte watched everything with her mother's eyes, observant, composed, missing nothing. Louis, at 6 years old, was simply Louis, which meant he was delightful and slightly chaotic, and on this particular morning he was enough of both that people laughed. The carriage moved through the crowd. Catherine raised her hand and waved, and the people who lined the route and really saw her in person for the first time in months, made a noise that was not quite cheering and not quite crying, but existed somewhere in the complicated territory between them. She looked well. She looked thin in the way that chemotherapy makes a person thin. Not fashion thin, not photographed in the right light thin, but the thinness of someone whose body has been working very hard at something invisible. She wore it openly, without apology or concealment, and there was something in that openness that moved people more than any managed statement from a palace communications team could have done. She was simply there. After all those months of absence and speculation and tabloid nonsense and public concern, she was simply there, sitting in a carriage with her children, waving to strangers who felt absurdly and genuinely that they knew her. Later that day, she took her place on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. She stood beside William. The children stood with them. Below, the crowd stretched back as far as the eye could reach. A military band played. Aircraft flew overhead in formation, their colored smoke trailing across a June sky. And Catherine stood at the edge of that balcony with an expression that was hard to read entirely, somewhere between relief and resolve, between the person she had been before January and the person she was becoming on the other side of it. King Charles was there too. His return to the formal ceremonies of his role had been gradual and careful, each public appearance measured against his energy and his treatment schedule. He looked, to those watching closely, like a man who had been reminded that time is not infinite, and who had decided to use what remained of it deliberately. There was something different in the way he engaged with people during this period, a warmth that had always been present, but that now surfaced more easily, more quickly, as though the illness had dissolved whatever layer of formality had kept it at a slight distance. People who met him in this period consistently remarked on it. He seemed, in the strange calculus of serious illness, more himself. The summer of 2024 brought Catherine back into view in small measures. She attended the Wimbledon men's singles final in July, arriving with Princess Charlotte, the two of them entering the royal box to a standing ovation that filled center court. She sat, and she watched, and she smiled, and she applauded, and when a match was over, she shook hands with the players in the way that royal attendance at sporting events requires, and she did all of it with the steady competence that had always characterized her public appearances. But those who watched her carefully, and there were millions of them, noticed that she moved with a kind of deliberateness that had not been there before. Not slowness, deliberateness, as if each step was considered, as if she was choosing each moment rather than simply moving through it. Behind the scenes, the chemotherapy continued. The palace had confirmed in the early months that her preventative treatment had begun in February and would run for several months. She did not discuss the specifics publicly. She did not describe what it felt like did not document the difficult days, did not allow the inside of her illness to become content. She made her appearances when she could, disappeared when she needed to, and trusted that the public would understand. For the most part, the public did. The well-wishers outnumbered the intrusively curious. The sympathy was real and broadly sustained. People sent letters to the palace, left flowers at the gates. A woman who had spent years representing an institution that is by definition about maintaining dignity in the face of whatever comes was now doing it in the most personal circumstances imaginable, and somehow managing to make dignity look not cold but human. September 2024 brought the announcement that her chemotherapy was finished. She released a video, filmed in Norfolk, where the family had spent the summer. She sat outdoors, relaxed in a way that only genuine countryside relaxation looks. Not the curated outdoorsiness of a photo opportunity, but the real ease of someone in a place that belongs to them. William was there. The children were there. Her parents, Michael and Carol Middleton, were there too, playing board games with their grandchildren in the background. And the presence of Catherine's parents, rarely glimpsed in public contexts, gave the video a texture of genuine family life that was almost startling in its warmth. She spoke carefully and without self-pity. She said the 9 months had been incredibly tough for the whole family. She said she was relieved to have finished the treatment. She said her focus now was on staying cancer-free, and that the path to full healing would be long, and that she intended to take each day as it came. Doing what I can to stay cancer-free is now my focus. Simple words. The kind of words a person uses when they have thought very carefully about what actually matters and cleared away everything that doesn't. She would begin, the palace said, a gradual return to public duties. A handful of engagements over the coming months. Nothing overwhelming. Nothing scheduled too far in advance. The cautious language of an institution that had learned, over the previous 9 months, to hold its plans loosely. Her first formal engagement following the end of treatment came in mid-September, a meeting focused on early years education in the United Kingdom, a cause she had championed for years. She sat, and she listened, and she spoke, and she engaged with the work in the same way she always had, methodically, with genuine curiosity, asking questions that revealed she had done the reading and was not simply performing interest. Those who worked in the field she was visiting noted that she seemed focused, present, engaged in the way that someone is engaged when they have recently been reminded that their time is not unlimited and have decided to spend it on things that actually matter. In October, she and William visited Southport, the town where a devastating knife attack in July had killed 3 young girls at a dance class and injured many more. They met with emergency responders. They met with parents. The photographs from that visit showed Catherine in quiet conversation with people who had been through something unimaginable, and there was something in those photographs that was different from the formal royal engagement photographs of the years before. She was not performing empathy. She had just spent 9 months in the company of fear, in the company of the knowledge that terrible things happen without warning to people who have done nothing to deserve them. She sat with those parents, and she listened, and the listening looked different because it was different because she was bringing something to that room that she had not possessed before January 2024. Charles, meanwhile, was moving through his own parallel recovery. His treatment had continued through the year, the specifics remaining largely private. He had kept up with the paperwork of the crown, the reading of government documents, and the meetings with ministers that constitute the working engine of a constitutional monarchy, even when the public ceremonies were suspended. He had spoken in a measured way that monarchs speak about personal matters, about what the experience had given him. He said it had deepened his appreciation for the work of cancer charities. He spoke about the community of care that surround a cancer patient, the specialists, the nurses, the volunteers, the researchers, and praised them with the kind of specificity that only comes from having needed them personally. By the end of 2024, both Catherine and Charles were on trajectories that felt cautiously like progress. Catherine had announced at the start of 2025 that her cancer was in remission. She had visited the Royal Marsden NHS Foundation Trust in London, the specialist cancer hospital where she had received her treatment, and she had met with patients there. She had told one of them that the impact on her family had been really, really tough. She had thanked the staff. She had become, jointly with William, a patron of the institution, and that patronage felt less like a ceremonial appointment and more like a debt of gratitude acknowledged in the only way a princess could acknowledge it, publicly and with the weight of the institution behind it. She was in remission. She was still adjusting, as she put it, to a new normal. She had told the world, carefully and without dramatization, that she could no longer function at home the way she once had, that the body she was living in was not yet the body she had lived in before January 2024. That recovery was not a straight line, but a landscape with hills and valleys and unexpected difficult stretches even after the treatment was done. She described it as a roller coaster, and it was clear from the way she said it that she was not using the phrase casually. She had ridden it. She knew the specific topography, but she was here. She was visible. She was in remission, and she was doing what she had always done, showing up, doing the work, finding in the doing of it something that steadied her. The stage was being set for something that the months of absence had made the public hungry to see. Not just a return, a real return. The kind that doesn't look like a press release, but looks like a person who went somewhere very dark and found their way back, and is now choosing to stand in the light again. The kind that a palace can confirm, but cannot manufacture. The kind that lands differently when it finally arrives because of how long and how completely it has been waited for. That landing was still coming. But everything in the preceding months, every careful appearance, every measured statement, every quiet visit to a cancer ward, every moment of a king stepping back in front of his people with something new in his eyes, had been preparation for it. The return was being built, not from public relations decisions, but from the slow and very private work of getting well enough to come home. There is a morning at Buckingham Palace that people who were there will not forget. June 2025. Trooping the color again. The year turning, as it does, and the ceremony marking it, as it does, with all the precision and the color and the organized splendor that Britain does better than almost anywhere else on earth. But this one felt different from the moment it began because this one had Catherine in it, not as a quiet guest in a carriage, not as a figure seen briefly from a distance and then gone, but as the full, visible, unmistakable presence she had been before all of it. She rode with her children. She stood on the balcony. She waved to the crowd. And the crowd, which had been told she was coming and had still managed to be surprised by the reality of her, responded with the kind of sound that buildings feel in their foundations. It was more than a royal appearance. In a family built on symbolism, in an institution whose entire function rests on the idea that showing up matters, Catherine's presence at that ceremony was a statement written in the oldest language the monarchy knows. She was here. She had been away, and now she was here, and the here of her meant something that the palace's communications team, for all its competence, could not have written into a press release. It had to be seen. It had to be felt from across a crowd. It had to land in the chest the way that things land when they have been waited for long enough. William stood beside her. He had aged in the way that people age when they carry something heavy for a sustained period of time. Not dramatically, not visibly to someone who hadn't been paying attention, but noticeably to those who had been watching closely throughout the year. He was 36 days from 40 years old. He was the husband of a woman in remission from cancer, the son of a father in recovery from the same, the heir to a throne that had required him to hold more than he had ever publicly let on. He stood on that balcony, and he looked at the crowd, and there was something in his face that read, if you knew how to read it, like a man who had been holding his breath for a very long time and was only now, slowly, beginning to let it go. Charles was there. 76 years old, a year into a reign that was supposed to be measured and ceremonial and steady, now on the other side of a cancer diagnosis that had forced him to confront, in the most concrete possible terms, the limits of the body he was asking to carry the crown. He had continued to reduce his treatment schedule through the back half of 2024 and into 2025, his medical team reporting positive progress, the palace language gradually becoming more optimistic. By the time he stood on that balcony in June 2025, his treatment had been significantly reduced. He described the reduction as a personal blessing. He described what the journey had given him, not in the vague, inspirational language of someone reaching for something reassuring to say, but in the specific language of a person who had actually been changed by something. He said his experience had given him an even deeper appreciation of the extraordinary work done by cancer charities and those who support them. He praised the specialists and the nurses and the researchers and the volunteers with the particularity of a man who had needed them, who had sat in the waiting rooms and had the conversations and had been carried for a period by the competence and the care of people who do that work every day without ceremony or applause. He had always been a patron of charitable causes in the formal sense that royals are patrons. Now he was something more specific, a person who understood from the inside what those causes are actually for. In February 2026, Catherine released a video message to mark World Cancer Day. It was quiet and personal in a way that most royal communications are not. She spoke in voiceover about fear and exhaustion and the moments of strength and kindness and profound connection that a cancer journey contains. She said that the disease touches so many lives. She spoke to everyone facing a diagnosis, undergoing treatment, or finding their way through recovery, and she said, "Please know you are not alone." The video accompanied footage from her visit to the Royal Marsden the previous year. She was not performing compassion for the camera. She was not speaking as an ambassador for a cause she had been assigned. She was speaking as a person who had been in those rooms, who had received treatment alongside other patients, who had felt what it feels like to be uncertain about the future and to need someone to tell you that you're not in it alone. The response was enormous. Messages flooded in from around the world, from people who were themselves going through treatment, from people who had lost someone, from people who had survived and were still finding their way through the particular disorientation of the other side. They responded to her not as a princess, but as a person who had been through the same door they had been through or were standing in front of, and who had come out the other side and turned back to say something true about the experience. Charles released his own message for World Cancer Day the day before hers. He spoke of being profoundly moved by the community of care around every cancer patient. He spoke of the remarkable advances in cancer treatment that had been made in recent years, advances he had personal reason to be grateful for. The two messages, released a day apart, formed something that no palace press office could have scripted, a genuine human dialogue between two people who had navigated illness in public and were now choosing to use that experience in a way that reached beyond the usual parameters of royal duty. This is what the return of Catherine and Charles turned out to be. Not the resumption of a schedule, not the reopening of an institution after a temporary closure. It was something more complicated and more significant than that. It was the emergence of two public figures who had been reshaped by private experience and whose presence in public life now carried something it had not carried before, the weight of surviving something real. Catherine, in the summer of 2025, began taking on what the palace described as a light program of public engagements. She visited hospitals. She attended events connected to the causes she had championed for years: early childhood development, mental health, the support of military families. She showed up, and when she showed up, she brought with her the particular quality that serious illness sometimes imparts to a person: a concentration on what actually matters, a patience with what is difficult, an absence of the small anxieties that tend to crowd out the larger ones when a person is healthy, and taking things for granted. She told patients at a cancer support center in Colchester that recovery was not a smooth path, that it was a roller coaster, that there were hard times even after treatment ended. She said it not as a warning, but as a solidarity, as the thing that someone says when they want another person to know that they are not failing by finding it difficult. The woman who had once seemed to exist at a polished and somewhat unreachable remove from ordinary difficulty, was now sitting beside strangers and saying, "This is hard, and I know it is hard, and that is okay." William described the year they had been through as brutal. He said it quietly, and once, but he said it. It was the most honest assessment of a royal family year that anyone in his position had offered in modern memory. And it landed not as a complaint, but as a fact. It was brutal. The children had grown up through it. George, already 11, was old enough to understand more than his parents would have wished him to need to understand. Charlotte and Louis had their own versions of the year, shaped by their ages and their sensibilities and whatever their parents had found the right words to tell them. The family had moved through something together, and they had come through it, and the coming through it was visible on all of them in different ways. The monarchy that emerged on the other side of 2024 was not identical to the monarchy that had entered it. It was not diminished. If anything, the trials of the year had produced something like a renewed clarity of purpose, a stripping away of the decorative and the dispensable, and a concentration on whatever remained when all of that was cleared away. What remained was service. What remained was showing up. What remained was the willingness to stand in front of millions of people and say, "This is hard, and we're doing it anyway, and we hope that in the watching of it you find something that helps you do the hard things in your own life." Charles continued his duties into 2026 with the momentum of someone who had been reminded what those duties were actually for. He was more direct in his engagements, more personal, less guarded. He brought to the ceremonial functions of his role a quiet warmth that the illness had either created or uncovered, something that had perhaps always been present but had lived beneath layers of formality and expectation and the weight of waiting, and that the cancer had stripped to the surface. Catherine, in remission but still adjusting to a new normal, was building the next version of her public life carefully and on her own terms. She was choosing her engagements with purpose. She was showing up to things that mattered and not showing up to things that didn't, and the palace was supporting that approach without apology. She had said publicly that she would attend events when she felt well enough. When she appeared, people were grateful. When she didn't, people understood. The contract between her and the public had been quietly renegotiated, and the new terms were kinder and more honest than the old ones. On World Cancer Day in February 2026, when she said, "Please know you are not alone," she was not reading from a script. She was reporting back from somewhere she had actually been. She was the message and the messenger at once, in a way that only genuine experience makes possible, in a way that no amount of staff for preparation or institutional machinery can manufacture. And that in the end was what the long pause and the long return had given not just to Catherine and to Charles, but to the institution they represented, the irreplaceable credibility of people who have been through something and are standing on the other side of it, still standing, still present, still choosing every day to show up. The palace confirmed it. The world watched it. But the truth of it belonged to something that press releases do not reach, to the private rooms and the long nights and the ordinary mornings that nobody photographed, to the children who went to school while their mother was ill and their grandfather was ill and their father was holding everything together with both hands, to the quiet conversations in hospital corridors that will never appear in any official record, to the particular human knowledge that survives a serious illness and becomes, in the surviving, something that a person carries differently from anything else they have ever been given. They came back, both of them, and the coming back mattered in the way that returns only matter after the leaving has been real and long and genuinely uncertain and survived.